All right. I think we're going to move right into this session. So just know we have two more sessions left. One is here on enrollment and budget crisis. And then we have a really awesome session around technology and AI coming from Ryan Alou from our sponsor partner, FMX. So really good sessions. As I mentioned before, if you have any need for any of the previous sessions, we're going to include the recording for those sessions um, in an email to you after the fact. So if you want to share it with anybody on your team, if you want to do that, please feel free to do that. And so we'll send a recording with those sessions after the fact here. But if you also want to get in contact with any of our speakers, I'm sure that you'd be willing to talk to you as well. So just send us a quick note to that email or to any of the emails that we've sent to you previously. And we can definitely put you in touch with those speakers as well as we move forward. So with this session, we're going to take a step back and really kind of look at that nuts and bolts. I think we've heard from a lot of speakers. This is top of mind when we think about kind of enrollments, what to prepare for as we're thinking about it, how that impacts the budgets, not only from an educational perspective, but also how does that impact our operational budgets, and some of the really kind of interesting pitfalls that it has when many of the folks that are making decisions on the school board level or the school administrator level are really focused on the education of those aspects. But, as Rob mentioned, there it's like, how do we translate what operations does and how you think about operations, whether that's, the number of people you need to clean a space to, the routine maintenance that has to happen depending on the age of the building, right? And how do we actually translate that so that we're advocating on behalf of our operations teams so that they're not just doing spreadsheet exercises that are cutting budgets to such a thin margin that you're not able to achieve the expectations that, the principals have, that teachers have, that students have, and the community has, so that you're underserving those constituents within your districts or within your higher ed accounts as well. So with that, I'm going to get started. My name is Chris Brablc. I lead marketing here at Crowd Comfort. I am really focused on how do we actually start to work with clients, school districts, prospects, and how do we really start to understand what's happening. And so I'm, looking at research reports all the time. This presentation will include a lot of interesting research reports, some, very recent, some, a little bit older, but, in general, they're painting a picture of how do we actually start to look at our funding exercises, but also start to communicate that. So I hope that from this presentation, we're going to go over a few different things. We're going to focus on kind of the first, some of the data around the enrollment crisis that is facing many districts. Then we'll go into how that affects budgets and how that is affecting budgets as we move forward. Then we're going to look at the operations reality that many school districts are facing and some numbers that hopefully you can take there. And then maybe kind of get into what I call radical ideas. Some of them aren't that radical, but they are definitely changes to how we might think about operations going forward based on these realities. And then, any questions that you have throughout, I'm happy to answer them. Just put them into the chat and we'll move forward from there. So with that, I'm going to go forward and start to look at some of the enrollment trends that we see. So I think first and foremost, and Rob touched on it a little bit here, but when we look at birth rates, especially past COVID, we're seeing that it's at a historic low in terms of people having kids. And obviously, when we look at kind of COVID, we're starting to see the first kind of inklings of it hit public education. So kids are finally in that realm where they're looking at, going to preschool, going to, elementary school. And we're going to see that decline happen over time. And so just from a pure birth rate perspective, we're going to see less students available for public schools. And when we look at National Center of Education statistics data, already we've seen a drop in 3.8%. But when we look at 2031, we're seeing additional students drop off based on what those projections are based on the birth rates. And so just from a pure, like the number of students that are available to go to public education, there is going to be a pretty drastic decline over the next several years. And if these birth rates keep in this realm, we're going to see this as a constant trend. And so the biggest thing here is, we're going to have to look at how many schools we have and what locations, and look at those capital investments in addition to those operations spend, and do that way more thoughtfully as we move forward, because I think we're hitting a point where, based on demographics and based on the age of the population, we're going to see a decline in birth rates and students that are available. Now, when we look at this, I think there's a number of other things that also are really interesting when you look at the data. One is looking at public schools versus charter and private school movement. In general, we've seen charter schools, especially with school voucher programs and states that do it, Florida being one of the biggest examples. We're seeing that enrollment is growing in those schools. In general, that is a pretty big hit for public schools in those states. And we're seeing it on a 7 to 9% enrollment increase post 2020. And so there's alternatives to public educations that are coming. We're seeing that there's student movement happening just within states from the public to more private and charter options. The other thing that we have seen from pre-COVID baselines is that homeschooling has increased pretty significantly. I think part of it is from health concerns or people doing it during COVID when you couldn't go into a school district or area there. But you're seeing that some families are electing to homeschool their children. And so this will be a really interesting thing to see if this continues as we get farther and farther away from students being with their families as a necessity during the COVID saga. But I think in general, both of these are really interesting things to look at, especially in states that are encouraging voucher programs as well. The other thing that we're seeing with our enrollments is we're seeing it affect different types of schools differently, right? So in general, we're seeing that urban, rural, and suburban districts are all seeing different effects when it comes to how much enrollment is impacting their budget. When we look at this data, we had RAND data, which is a government organization, start to ask urban school district leaders, how much is budget being impacted by student enrollment? And urban school districts said about 37% where that was impacted. Rural school districts said 39%, and suburban districts 25%. And so we're seeing that, overall, when we look at districts in general, those being most impacted by the enrollment, especially when it comes to their budgets, it's happening with urban school districts and rural school districts as opposed to suburban school districts, where also there are funding challenges. But from a student movement standpoint, urban and rural are being hit the hardest. When we look at movement, we're also seeing some state movements in terms of state-by-state student movement across the board. When we look at that, California, New York, Illinois, and Michigan account for nearly half of kind of the movement and school enrollment decline when you look at the shifts of students across states. Now, this makes a whole lot of sense. California specifically New York, Illinois, all have major school districts that have a lot of students. And so when you're seeing this trend, it makes sense that they would have the most student movement, but over half is a sizable amount. And so, as we see folks that have moved away from city centers, right, and moved outside of COVID and made those decisions, we're also seeing that impact those enrollments. And a lot of those districts in those states are also, seeing those enrollment declines on a per student level because of that shift. Now, we're also seeing some states that have experienced flight or net positive student enrollment as well. So Idaho, Utah, Texas, Florida has been a big area, Delaware, South Carolina. We're seeing other states be impacted positively when it comes to students coming into those states. And with that, we're also seeing kind of enrollment booms. One thing that's really interesting here is when we look at buildings and number of school buildings, we're also seeing a little bit more capital intensive growth happening in those states, right? Because students are entering those states, they're entering those districts, and so they're getting more money to be able to satisfy that population of students. As we move forward, it'll be interesting to see if those state by state movements continue to show from those states to these other states as we move forward. Because again, I think they're with school choice, with cost of living in many of the states, there is sizable just movement that is happening population wise that is going to impact enrollment in different districts much more heavily, especially if you're probably urban school districts in these states. The other aspect, and again, I think we've heard ad nauseum that the ESSER cliff was coming, right? And we've seen a lot of districts already dealing with a lot of the fallout from more long-term commitments that they've spent with ESSER funding on things that they wanted to do that happened during COVID, and having those budget decisions now really impact and make it much harder to make budget decisions over the last few years. And so when we've seen a lot of that, we've had, probably 190 billion, around 190 billion kind of enter public school districts through the ESSER funds. And that money has gone away, right? And so there was a number of short-term commitments, but, adding teachers, adding staff, you're seeing a lot of districts have to make really tough decisions on where they want to keep that funding. And how do they actually start to get funding outside of that to be able to keep their programs? What I can say is that when we look at ESSER dollars, there were some permanent commitments that a lot of districts made, whether that's HVAC, whether that's FTEs or vendor contracts there. But we've also seen that a lot of those operational comebacks are significantly impacting operations because many districts, rightfully so, are prioritizing a lot of the educational gains that they did through those ESSER funds and looking to operations to help find savings, when they're looking at the impact on the students. Now, what we've seen and what we've talked about earlier, especially with Eric and others, we know that the facilities that that a student walks into, that a teacher walks into, that a parent walks into, significantly impacts that enrollment, significantly impacts the absenteeism around that, and the performance of the learning that is happening in those schools. And so, but when we're looking at spreadsheets and looking at making decisions on these budgets that are incredibly difficult, we're seeing that operations teams often are a little bit neglected when we think about how do we actually provide those types of environments. The other aspect here that we look at is enrollment is declining. The other thing that is happening is that chronic absenteeism is still raised. When we looked at it pre-pandemic, it was around 15% by all totals. During the pandemic and just afterwards, it rose to about 28% of students, which is an incredibly high number. And we've seen it settle back down to 24%. The other, what I liken this to is, in-person work, right? I think we think about it from a school district. You're in person all the time, but we've seen a lot of things happen where it was predominantly, oh, workers have to go home, and now we've settled at a higher rate of chronic absenteeism than it was before, just because of the interactions and the toughness of that COVID interrupted. And so when we look at the big things that operations and our facilities and our school buildings can do, chronic absenteeism and the health and safety of those districts, whether that's the chemicals you use, whether that's just making sure cleanings are actually happening, those things directly impact absenteeism, and we need to make sure that that is a priority. As many states take into account chronic absenteeism when they think about that funding and think about the students that you're going to get dollars for. And I think one of the things that's really interesting, and Rob makes mention of it, and we really look at it in different ways, but we have to win back students. And winning back students isn't just getting them to enroll in your school or your school district. It's also about making sure that they attend 90% of the time, right? And so how do we start to make sure that those environments are clean and healthy so that they're not getting sick and that's not driving absenteeism? But also, how is it a good place that they feel good about going to each and every day? Within that is becoming a bigger issue. And the biggest thing, I think when we think about operations is, we're seeing declining budgets, but we're also seeing that we're making a lot of near-term decisions that are and future commitments are piling up time and time again. When we look at our capital investments in that backlog, the gap in our backlog, it's about 56 billion across U.S. school districts right now. That is a big amount. And so that's, new schools, that's HVAC repair, that's anything that is a large capital expense for those schools. We also see that, I think, that reality is that we have aging buildings. The average age of a school district or a school in a district is around, 30 to 35 years old. And so we're seeing that our schools are breaking down a bit. And we keep on pushing investments on because we have to, right? Because we're trying to find budget elsewhere. The other area there is we also see about $34 billion in just a gap in routine maintenance and operations. And so this is where we see the daily operations that Rob talked about, where it's like, we can't do the best, but we have to have expectations of doing the job in the best way we can. And so, just in general, we're seeing that, a lot of our areas, and when we think about budgets and operations, we're not only dealing with less budget year to year to do the things that we need to do, but we're also piling up a lot of kind of building debt, so to speak, that is impacting kind of the future and our ability to do future things. And this really kind of brings it all kind of full circle when we think about kind of the budget problem that exists for many operations leaders. The enrollment drop, the chronic absenteeism, the building debt that we are carrying year to year are all looking at different funding drops and making really difficult decisions for operations leaders in terms of what to prioritize, the daily staff that they need to be able to make sure that these buildings are good environments for students, teachers, and the community. And then, I think also just kind of looking at what decisions do we have to make? right? Are there different things that we can do? Because we can't do a lot of the operations that are suggested to us by a lot of industry publications, industry certifications, as we look at it. In general, it's estimated there's about $895 per student shortfall for the average K through 12 district on operations and maintenance spend. We're seeing capital outlays be about a $1,500 shortfall, and I think this brings a few different really interesting challenges when we're communicating our budgets and our need for spend. So, two things here, right? One is we're looking at the budgets. We look at it at a per student level for pretty much most educational types of expenses, and what we're spending. I can tell you that from a school building infrastructure standpoint, we're not lowering it terribly much, right? We're not closing schools. I think there's a lot of equity issues with regards to that. But that means that the square footage that we need to clean every day is not changing really, depending on what we're looking at. And so when we think about how much spend we do on a square foot for maintenance, routine maintenance, or for cleaning, which is standard across the industries, the administrators that are making decisions are thinking on a per student level and thinking that the level of service and the things actually match up, which there is a disconnect there, right? And so how do we actually communicate, to Rob's point, how do we communicate what that means, right? What does square footage mean in terms of the operations that we're able to do on a daily basis? So when we think about all of this, right, it really becomes to, we know that do more with less, right? And doing the things that we do from a strategy standpoint are just not possible, right? We can't just roll it back and expect different results and drive that forward in a way that is really impactful to the students and staff that we want, and to everything that we're trying to achieve. And so the question is, how do we change it? And so here is where I am putting a warning. Some of these might be radical ideas. I also understand the change management piece of this is incredibly hard and incredibly difficult. And so, I think harkening back to Eric, when we began this conversation, it's all about how do we start to continuously improve? How do we get data? How do we start to make bets and understand where those bets are and measure them in a way that allows us to know, hey, did it work, did it not? And moving forward, how do we become more agile? And so these are some ideas of, when we're talking to districts, things that they're thinking about, but also, ways that we might be able to drive forward better operations as we continue to try to make do with the budget allotments that are declining year over year. So when we think about some of the radical ideas, one, and this is probably one of the things that I think from a mindset standpoint is probably the biggest disconnect to the people in the building and the people that are doing managing the operations and managing those operations budgets. One is that every place needs to be spotless clean every day, and that is the expectation. Now, when we think about a lot of the operation budget, I can tell you every district is understaffing their custodial based on the expectations from industry standards. When we look at APPA, when we look at other standards, most try to get level 2. Level 2 is orderly tidiness. But in general, we're staffing at like a 20,000 per square feet per custodian, when that level is usually is 16,800. And so when we think about those different levels, there's just a big disconnect on what is expected and what we can deliver. Where we've seen organizations start to think about is, hey, well, maybe I don't have to clean every space that is in my districts. When we think about buildings that aren't underutilized, where we're maybe only utilizing certain classrooms, or where enrollment is there, how do we actually connect that utilization to our services to help to manage and drive down costs, but also just do more with a smaller team? And so, this idea of how do we know when classrooms are used, how do we section those off, and then how do we alert the teams on a daily basis on what they should be cleaning and communicating that is a big deal. That can help us, take these smaller teams, make sure that the spaces that are being used get cleaned on a consistent basis, and then maybe mix in cleanings here and there to the other spaces based off of different scheduling and based on the utilization and the capacity of our teams. And so one of those things, hey, do we have to clean every room every night or every day 100% of the time? I think in the era of schools being underutilized, right, and not having 100% utilization, I think we need to think about smarter ways to do that. The other one is looking at and having set schedules and set teams for different schools that never change. We've seen a number of districts that have schedules that they've had for 10, 15 years. Now, one of the things here is the problem that many exist is the communication, right? How do we actually communicate different protocols, different schedules, and how do we actually start to understand staffing and performance across those schools? Those are big issues for many districts. But I think in general, the idea of being able to have a good tracking mechanism that is centralized, but also being able to start to think about the school, and it's like, hey, are we overstaffing? Are we understaffing? How can we look at the square footage that each custodian is doing? Different schools, and then having rotations, right? Being able to move custodians from school to school every once in a while, where we can, improve the performance across the board across schools, versus having some schools that are getting a ton of attention and doing really well, and some that are just not doing well at all. And so how do we start to build kind of that pulse of understanding what schools are doing well from a quality perspective, and then start really looking at that staffing so that we're doing that on a more consistent basis? Because I think in general we often realize that certain schools are being neglected, or the performance is just not nearly as good as other schools especially across big districts. The other thing that I think is really interesting, right, is how do we start to talk to other non-domain experts around some of the operations and some of the things that we're doing, but also some of the challenges that we have with our staffing, the challenges we have with operational expectations within those schools. And so when we think about a lot of this, one of the things that I think is really interesting, and I was talking to a district the other day, and they were starting to have these conversations on a more consistent basis, is really looking at principals and school administrators and having that conversation about what they want to see from the custodial services that are in their school. And so when I say that, it's really kind of focused on, well, hey, do you want the custodian to just do their rounds and clean, different rooms? Do you want them to be accountable to things that happen throughout the day, and to be alerted and clean after a staff meeting, or clean a spill, or clean something where a student had an issue or a problem? And so when we think about that, that becomes a much interesting conversation, saying, hey, this is the resources that we have. Here are the things that we can do, right? The idea that, hey, we can clean every room while addressing any issue that happens in that building over the course of the day, many aren't staffed to that degree. And so how do we have that conversation? How do we continue to drive that forward and have them feel like they're part of the process is kind of a big deal. I think principals often have so much on their plate that they look at facilities and often might be a problem there. And so how do we actually make sure that we tailor services a little bit more and explain those operational realities that exist on a school by school level basis. And then, as we think about this, and this is, an example of, a conversation that we were talking through and really looking at when it comes to our having those conversations with principals is, starting to look at on different schools where the custodian acts more like a day porter than a custodian that does their rounds. So, in an idea here is looking at on demand. They might come in, they might do cleaning and spot checks around what the night custodian does at the beginning of the day. But then that day porter is going to, do scheduled room cleanings, but as they are needed, right? As they can go forward, they might focus on cleaning and maintenance issues as they arise. So they're a resource for teachers, students, staff to really have big elements here. And then, just in general, having that night custodian that is really focused on, hey, that full school environment when we look at that. And so with all of that, a big thing here is transparency. The biggest thing that we can do is be as transparent as possible our limitations and different things here. I brought this from Framingham. I think they put together really interesting stuff. They're still not doing transparency on some of the routine maintenance and cleaning that they're doing, but they're doing a lot of transparency across that. Can we start to really give transparency into what we're doing on a daily basis for clean, safe, well-maintained schools? And so how can we move old paradigm to a new paradigm? How can we start to really focus on all the services we're doing? And how can we question some of the assumptions and some of the things that we do already? Like, do we need equal services everywhere, regardless of usage or utilization? Or can we use that data to start to drive more on-demand services or more strategic use of services? Can we look at staffing, on a more consistent basis? Can we move people around? Can we help to drive better outcomes across more schools? And then last but not least, can we have radical transparency, right? Can we start to really bring data to those meetings every time? Can we give the community data on all the things we're doing so that we can be recognized for the hard work we're doing, but also, get them involved in that operational transparency? And so